Welcome to this Conversations on Grung episode. Today, we wanted to talk about ways that the Armenian American community can promote its common interests and priorities through this year's U.S. presidential election cycle. So we have with us the Executive Director of the Armenian National Committee of America, the ANCA, the ANCA, Aram Hamparian. Hello, Aram. Thanks for joining us.
It's an absolute pleasure.
Hi, Aram.
Thank you, Asbed. Thank you, Hovik.
Well, the Democratic and Republican national conventions have come and gone with great pomp and circumstance, and we now know the major candidates vying for the presidency of the United States, Donald Trump and J.D. Vance on one side, versus Kamala Harris and Tim Walz on the other side. Aram, up until President Biden's recognition of the Armenian genocide, and then Congress's near unanimous affirmation, the top Armenian American priority of advocating for our causes was recognition of the genocide. So what are the issues that are important for the Armenian American community during these 2024 elections?
I would say that our long-term goal, our North Star, has always been the security and survival of Armenia. The genocide issue, I think, took center stage and drew the most attention, but we pursued it not because it was an end in itself, but because we felt it would help make Armenia more secure and lead to sort of a more viable Armenia that would be safer in the region. I would say today, our highest priorities are deterring renewed Azerbaijani aggression, number one. Number two, supporting the Artsakh refugees. And number three, creating a pathway for the sustainable return of Armenians to their indigenous homes in Artsakh.
How large is the Armenian American community estimated at currently?
We have about 2 million Americans of Armenian heritage, and that includes people who are now in the fifth, even sixth generation, and also Armenians who have arrived very recently. It's a rich mix of Armenians from the Middle East, Armenians from Eurasia, Armenians who've been born and raised in this country. Heavy focus in the industrial Northeast, let's say from Boston down to Richmond, Virginia, out west to the Cleveland, Detroit, Chicago. Then, of course, California is the largest Armenian community. Probably half of the 2 million Armenians in America live in California, and that's primarily in Southern California, then later in the north, up near in the Bay Area, and of course, Central Valley, Fresno.
Wow. So you estimate that Southern California, for example, has between 500,000 and 750,000 Armenians?
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Okay.
So, Aram, I wanted to ask a little bit more information about the priorities and your assessment today of how close, how achievable those are given the current climate. Obviously, no challenge is impossible if you commit to it, but the sense I get from all these visits by U.S. State Department officials, making Zhingyalov huts, while essentially it reminds me of the scenes of like Feast during the plague, where they, all around everything is not very good, but they're just taking photo ops, making vague promises and leaving. What is your assessment of the potential for tighter cooperation between ANC and U.S. State Department, and how are the relations between the ANC and the U.S. State Department? Is there any communication? And if there isn't, is that a change from previous times? For instance, is my suspicion correct that basically the State Department is not being very communicative with the Armenian American community, or at least your organization?
Okay. Starting in the Biden administration as early as 2017 and continuing through the Biden administration until this very day, we have seen profound failings on the part of the U.S. government, our State Department, USAID, the Defense Department, the intelligence community. They armed Azerbaijan, enabled genocide, and then abandoned Artsakh as a matter of policy, not as an oversight, not as a matter of inattention, but rather of very intentional U.S. policy to embolden Azerbaijan, and in the full knowledge that Azerbaijan would attack and genocide the people of Artsakh. That is crystal clear. Not a single soul in the U.S. foreign policy establishment lost a single moment's sleep over the loss of Artsakh. And in the months, year since that crime, they have done nothing to hold Azerbaijan accountable, nothing meaningful to help the refugees, and nothing at all to establish a pathway home for the Armenians who were driven, ethnically cleansed from their indigenous homeland. So that is the policy of our State Department. It's sadly one that is at odds with the values that we purport to advance as Americans, the humanitarian principles, the human rights principles, the anti-genocide, genocide prevention values that we hold as a country. So yes, this State Department has been absolutely on the wrong side of the Artsakh issue, now on the Armenia issue. They view Armenia through the lens of Russia policy, Iran policy, defense policy, oil policy, Israel policy. You pick the issue. And if Armenia can be a tool to advance one of those other interests, if some configuration of Russia policy or Iran policy can be advanced at the expense of Armenia, it is advanced at the expense of Armenia. That is sadly where we are today. And we have made our views on that very clear to the State Department. The State Department and the U.S. diplomatic community has found in Nikol Pashinyan their preferred interlocutor. They see in him somebody who is malleable and will bend to any pressure from any corner. And they know that when they need to speak to their own citizens, their own taxpayers, the Armenian Americans who serve in the military and have contributed to every aspect of American life, they close the door on us because what we're saying is not convenient and doesn't fit their narrative. It is entirely undemocratic. It is against every principle that we are set to hold as a country. And for that, we believe that both Trump and Biden, the Trump-Pence administration, and currently the Biden-Harris administration have failed the test as Americans and certainly failed our test as Americans of Armenian heritage.
Yes, for a long time, I guess, the ANC has been the influential or one of the few influential organizations in the American Armenian community landscape. But there are only a few, only, I guess, a handful of real grassroots organizations, and you're one of them. So what you're telling us is a little bit disheartening, but at the same time, what is the ANCA's strategy to influence the 24 elections,
Sure.
having in mind this obvious, I don't know, boulder that we have in front of us, which is an administration and a deep state for whom Armenia is not a priority at all?
Armenia is a priority only to the extent that it's a commodity that can be bartered or traded like a pack of cigarettes for some marginal imagined advantage in most cases. Hovik, you've raised a really, really good point. And let me say this, that I think some Armenians feel a temptation to cheerlead or to just put let's say a rose-colored lens on everything that's happening, but that doesn't serve, that's no way to be a good Armenian. It's certainly no way to be a good American. Let me just sort of put this, break it down into baskets, okay? I'll start with first principles. Aristotle taught us that in terms of persuasion, you can use your pathos, which is your emotion. You can use your logos, which are your facts and logic. And you can use your ethos, which is your credibility. Let me touch on all three. We can make an exceptional argument, I think, and I think we do make decent arguments, good arguments, strong arguments on the level of geopolitics. Why U.S. policy is misguided, why a much more constructive approach to the region would not be so hostile to Armenia and Armenia's survival. Getting that across and winning people over in what you described, and I would agree, is a deep state, good luck. Good luck. If you're talking to somebody young, let's say 25 to 35, they're just out to impress and will never challenge the status quo because they're looking for the next promotion. If you're talking to people in their 40s or 50s, they're hoping for an ambassadorship, they're looking toward the future. And if they're older than that, they're creatures of the machine, they're too far in to ever change. Plus, they're looking for their next job after government service, which is going to triple or quadruple their salary in the private sector. So we should, at every juncture, make the logical case, the geopolitical arguments for a more balanced U.S. policy on Armenian issues. But there are limits to that. I think we all know that, given the nature of our system. In a more democratic system, I think we would have a fair hearing, and I think we'd have much brighter prospects, more viable pathway to improve policy. But that's sadly not the case in today's Washington. The second is the pathos, the emotion. How can we make the moral argument? How can we elicit the compassion, the sympathy, the pity even of Americans? How can we align with our American counterparts on issues of democracy or Christianity or sort of a European aspiration, all these various affinity type programs or pathos or emotion, right? You have to do that. And you build ties with the Christian groups and with the democracy groups and with the anti-war groups, and you do all that stuff, but recognizing also that that's a long game. And on any given day, dealing with any given crisis, it may not be sufficient, and very often isn't sufficient to the immediate task at hand. Which brings us to the third tier, or the third plane, which Aristotle called ethos. I would say it's our credibility, or even our constituency, our electoral power, our electoral punch, right? After all is said and done, after all the clever arguments have been advanced, after all the moral appeals have been made, the card that we are counting on more than any other is the power and the presence of Armenians as constituents in America, as taxpayers, as voters, as strong members of the or threads in the civic tapestry that make up our country. I think that's where we're going to make a difference and where we are trying to make a difference. And with the coming election, I think this is the perfect moment for us to flex our muscles as strongly as we can.
Aram, your organization is the largest grassroots advocacy group that we have, but there are some other organizations as well. Is there cooperation among Armenian organizations for better results through solidarity? Is there cooperation with other communities as well? What is your strategy to achieve our goals in Washington, D.C.?
We're always looking for common ground. We had a call today with a number of Armenian American organizations. We're in regular contact. They're all on speed dial. I think that sometimes we fetishize this notion of Armenians as a group that can't get along. If you benchmark us against almost any other ethnic group, I would even say almost any other group, pick it, industrial association, trade group, whatever it is, every constituency is complex, every constituency is diverse, and every constituency has internal challenges. I would say ours are considerably less. We just, as a people, have decided to make that the running meme of Armenian life, which is we can't get along. The fact is we actually do get along pretty well, certainly better than others. That being said, there's going to be a range of groups, right? I think we know that within the Armenian world, going back thousands of years, there have been those that are more, the survival strategy is more one of accommodation to power. And then there are others who are more, assert themselves more against power. That's just a spectrum that's, I think, exists in a lot of countries, but certainly marginal countries that have been ruled by foreign powers for parts of their history. So I think that's okay. And the trick is for groups to complement each other. Sometimes people are the bridge builders, and sometimes they're the hammer. And we need to have sort of like a rational, coordinated array of tools that get the job done. But I think generally speaking, we're doing okay. As a small ethnic group, we're relatively small ethnic group, coalitions are absolutely essential. And our coalition universe is actually pretty 360 universe of deep connections to other ethnics, especially Greeks. Greeks, I would say, are our number one ally. We work with Kurdish groups, the Syrian, Chaldean, Syriac, Aramean, sort of that basket of organizations and communities. Then with Christian organizations like In Defense of Christians, Christian Solidarity International, International Christian Concern, the Philos Project, and now there's a group called Save Armenia. So there's a Christian world. To the extent that we find common ground with our Jewish friends, like Jewish World Watch, we engage with our Jewish friends, although that's complicated with some geopolitical dynamics. And then among the more progressive world, we're very active with anti-war and anti-arms sales groups. Like, for example, we're working on a Senate resolution that would create oversight, a resolution that would require oversight of U.S. arms and military assistance to Azerbaijan. And in that effort, we've brought in groups like Amnesty International, Win Without War, Freedom House, things of that nature. So coalitions are the bread and butter of the ANCA. And on any given day, we're working on 4 or 5 fronts with different coalitions.
For me, I always wondered about this. There's this commonly perceived notion that Armenian community and the organizations are better connected with the Democrats rather than Republicans. I just want to challenge myself and ask whether that's true, because I think a lot of the people I know take this for granted. And if it is true, what is being done to change that? Or do we have the same communication channels with the Republicans as we do with the Democrats?
Okay, let me just point out from the start that our North Star is the survival of Armenia, the viability and security of the Armenian homeland. That's our North Star. And we work with others to the extent that it advances us toward that aim. Do we work more with Democrats or Republicans? I sometimes share the line that we're not the RNC, we're not the DNC, we're the ANC. And that is where our loyalty lies. Right. We don't fall on our sword for anybody. We don't carry water for anybody. We've been in this country now for 130, 140 years. We've seen a lot. We've done a lot. We certainly don't exist to the benefit of one partisan group or another. The Democrats have their virtues, Republicans have their virtues. Many in our community feel strongly about their Democratic and Republican leanings or independent leanings or third-party leanings, and that's great. Our approach is to meet everybody where they are in terms of our community and to work with them as brothers and sisters toward the issues that we share. If someone shows up as a strong Biden supporter, Harris supporter, strong Trump supporter, we say, okay, the F5, okay, let's get to work. That's number one. Number two, we engage the parties with absolutely open arms and welcome the support of every Democrat and every Republican. As it turns out, right, and this is a matter of like geography, of demographics, of immigration, Armenians tend to live in parts of the country that are represented by Democrats, right? And because politicians, this should come as no surprise to anybody, because politicians tend to be responsive to their voters, right? They tend to be more responsive to the Democrats tend to be slightly more responsive than Republicans. I think primarily because we happen to live in Democratic states and Democratic districts, but there's also like some history here, right? The Democratic Party, certainly since Franklin Roosevelt, has been a coalition party that's brought together unions and teachers and various ethnic groups and urban populations. It's a patchwork coalition type of party that brings many people together. And the culture of the Democratic Party is more like we give everyone their place at the table. The Republican Party, God bless the Republican Party, I'm not saying this as criticism, has tended to be a little bit more of a, let's say, an idea party. So the idea is something like, here are ideas, you support them or you don't. We don't especially like the hyphenization, right? The hyphen between Italian American or Greek American has never really been part of the Republican sort of way of thinking. So these are like some institutional reasons. The idea that like 50% of supporters of Armenian issues should be Democrats, 50% should be Republicans, is kind of like childish. It simply couldn't happen given the geography, given the demographics, given the history of the parties, given their varying cultures. This is how it's turned out, where let's say we'll offer a piece of legislation and there might be 100 co-sponsors and 75 might be Democrat, 25 might be Republican. That really says more about where Armenians live than anything else. And we would like to see nothing more than every member co-sponsor our measures. Sometimes we get told, like, you don't support the Republicans, therefore not a lot of Republicans supporting you. That's kind of putting it backwards. I mean, we're, after all, the voters. So this is where we are. I think that, Hovik and Asbed, that we live in, like, our people, our community is just utterly saturated in Democratic-Republican polarization, like nonstop. If they're watching the news, if they're watching social media, they just get a nonstop barrage of left-right venom. And then when in Armenian issues, they apply that heuristic or they apply that template to what we're doing, but it simply isn't the case. The Democrats and Republicans will, I guarantee you, work out their issues. They'll win or they'll lose on their own merits. We're probably not going to win or lose the battle for either side, but we can win or lose the battle for our side. We should take sides. And that's the Armenian side, because guaranteed nobody else will. Nobody else will. Nobody else in this country, God bless them all, will lift a finger for the Armenians if the Armenians don't lift a finger for ourselves. And counting on one party or the other to deliver us, to save us, what Mesibidi put again, that is just an absolute utter fiction. It's one that I think has existed in our Armenian experience for centuries now, this notion of an outside savior stepping in to save us, but it's not the case at all. I think we've seen that far too often in just the last couple of years.
Yeah. Well, so Trump was president from 2017 to 2021, and Harris has been VP in the White House from 2021 until now. During both administrations, Armenia suffered catastrophic losses to Turkey and Azerbaijan, including the ethnic cleansing of Artsakh's 150,000 Armenian population 1 year ago this month, September 2023. Trump's administration did nothing to prevent or stop the 44-day war in 2020, despite being fully apprised of the looming war. And the current administration did nothing to prevent the ethnic cleansing and depopulation of Artsakh in 2023. Aram, we've even heard from a guest on our podcast recently that one of his colleagues was being asked by State Department types way back in February of 2023 how the Armenian diaspora would react to the complete expulsion of Artsakh's Armenian population. This tells me that the U.S. was fully aware and probably conspiring with Azerbaijan in this act of genocide. So what is the ANC's rating and assessment for these two major candidates, Trump and Harris? And do their VPs matter?
Of course. Trump's spin was dramatically ramping up military assistance to Azerbaijan, which emboldened Azerbaijan, gave them the green light to attack. Two other things his administration did. Number one was to cut the humanitarian aid to Artsakh, which was at the time for demining. They made a very aggressive push to stop that assistance. because they viewed it as a quasi recognition. So they ramped up the aid. They cut off the aid to Artsakh, which was cruel. And third, they pushed the line, we must prepare the populations for peace, which is code word for the Armenians have to get used to genocide. It's had nothing to do with preparing Azerbaijan whatsoever. They were arming Azerbaijan. This euphemism of preparing populations for peace was just a code word for you Armenians get used to being genocided one more time.
Orwellian speak.
Yeah, and that is Trump bears responsibility for that. And I'm going to put a sharper point on what you said, Asbed. It's not simply that they did nothing to prevent; they did everything to enable. They were complicit in this crime. They gave arms to a openly genocidal country, knowing precisely what that country would do with that military assistance, and with the emboldenment, with the encouragement, with the green light that went along with that aid package. So that's Trump's sin. Biden's, in some ways, is even worse, because what he did was, in the wake of the 2020 attack, knowing everything that he knew about the unilateral, unprovoked aggression by Azerbaijan against Artsakh, he then continued that military assistance, and he did so within just hours of recognizing the Armenian genocide. He greenlit continued military assistance. He basically said, I'll recognize the genocide that happened a century ago at the same time as I'm arming a new genocide against these very people. There's an element of abject cruelty to what he did. He did that twice, knowing very well that Azerbaijan was not going to be held accountable. He didn't want Azerbaijan held accountable. He's done everything possible to, I think one of his officials, that they march out as part of these dog and pony shows on Capitol Hill, said before the attack, they said something like, we will not countenance an attack on Artsakh. Of course, within days there was an attack, and they did nothing to prevent it or nothing to even protest it. And then following that, the attack and the ethnic cleansing, another State Department mid-level official said there shall be no more business as usual with Azerbaijan. And of course, within days, they were back to business as usual. So both of these two were actively complicit in this crime. Just to be very, very clear on this point, this was not a matter of inattention. It was not a matter of inaction. It was not a matter of trying but being unsuccessful. It was being on the wrong side of the issue, enabling genocide, arming a genocidal state. So you asked about the vice presidential candidates. Both actually are interesting in that Congressman Waltz, when he was a representative in the Congress, was very supportive of Armenian issues. He attended our centennial program in the Capitol, spoke very passionately about the need to prevent renewed aggression against Armenians, a new Armenian genocide. He also spoke on Artsakh at an event we had on Capitol Hill. So his record has been positive. And at a lesser level, Vance's record has been good. He's talked about Azerbaijani aggression. He's touched on Azerbaijani violations of export laws and things of that sort. I would say Waltz has a higher profile. Vance has a bit of a lower profile. But both are, I think, the result of the Ohio community and the Minnesota community being in active touch with them. So, but not only have Trump and Harris not earned our support, both have acted against our community, and I think have a long way to go to make a legitimate claim for the votes of Armenian Americans.
Aram, first of all, how is it that these people who are actually supportive of Armenian causes understand our concerns and where we come from, move to the White House and no longer give any kind of, the rest of the way they just play lip service?
It's a good question. The White House has two faces, right? On the one hand, it's a policy-making body, and that's the National Security Council, which coordinates diplomacy, intelligence, and defense. And then on the other hand, it has a political face, right, which is get the president and his or her party reelected. I think that most of our interactions are more on the political side, and the policy side remains highly insulated from almost any outside influence. Like when Americans talk about taxes or education or healthcare, it's usually a pretty robust democratic discourse where everyone gets their say, with a school board meeting or something like that. It's a commonly accepted thing that everyone's got a voice in those particular debates. The national security state does everything possible to create barriers to democratic influences. And they try to insulate. They insulate the foreign policy decision-making process such that citizens have a very, very hard time having a voice. That, I think, is very intentional. So, for example, people might come to the executive branch through the humanitarian world or the political world or some other world. But what they find is that the national security decision making is far beyond their reach, far beyond their reach. And I think that's a painful reality, but that's simply the reality, and we have to learn how to deal with it. And one way to deal with it is you become such a political force that the senior people on the political side of the White House pick up the phone, talk to the policymakers and say, why are you trying to ruin our reelection? Why are you so angering Michigan residents, Michigan voters, such that we're going to have to sit outside of the White House for the next 4 years? That's the dynamic that works, not like knocking on the door of the National Security Council one more time, not making a moral appeal, not presenting a new fact sheet or a new case or argumentation. It really is in states like Michigan, Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, Georgia, Nevada, Arizona, in states like those.
The so-called swing states.
Yeah, and this election, as far as we can tell, and again, it's changed with Harris coming in. This election is very likely to be decided in 6 or 7 states. It's kind of a sad testament to our democracy that all the voters in states like New York and California, don't seem to make much of a difference. But the fact is, we do have in Nevada, there's more Armenians per capita than in any other swing state. In Michigan, there's about 72,000 Armenians, and we're allied with a very large number of other Americans in Michigan. So our hope, and this is, I may be jumping the gun a little bit here, our hope is that at the end of this election cycle, we will be viewed increasingly as a group that is not just making a moral case, not just presenting facts, but a group that can tip close elections, that we are a group that policymakers and politicians do not want to cross. We do not take genocide well, nor should we. We do not forgive the arming of a genocidal state that killed thousands of young Armenian men and women. Those are unforgivable sins. And if at the end of the day that costs one side or the other the election, well, maybe they should have thought of that before they did that. It is not our problem to save the republic from the left or the right. It is our mission to make sure that our country does not betray the Armenian people, does not arm yet another genocide of the Armenian people.
Right.
Right. Aram, that's a nice segue to our next topic, which is we know that since the genocide in Gaza, all types of support for the government of Israel, which has killed more than 40,000 Palestinians, at least officially, and there are estimates of much higher numbers. I think Lancet reported more than 180,000. Arab Americans have started this uncommitted national movement to tell the administration that their support is not a sure thing, and that they need to hear more thoughtful and balanced U.S. approach to the war in Gaza. And one reason why their movement has legs is that Michigan is home to many Arab Americans, and you mentioned there are many Armenians in Michigan as well, and Michigan is a swing state. So can you tell us a little bit more, what does this uncommitted movement mean?
Sure.
Is Armenia part of that movement officially, or are we making any inroads into that movement? And what our strategy will be in swing states such as Michigan?
Sure. I just returned from Detroit this weekend, actually, where along with several thousand Armenians from around the country, we celebrated the Armenian Youth Federation Olympics and had a chance to consult with the community leaders there on exactly this point. We did take part in the primary in Michigan, formally supported the uncommitted vote. There were 13% of Democrats casting votes in the Democratic primary voted uncommitted. That number actually went up in a number of other states. And I think it was a pretty powerful signal to the Democratic establishment. I don't think it changed policy, but I think it was a good wake-up call. So, yeah, our understanding with the other partners in that effort, and they were largely Arab and Muslim Americans, was that on the question of disapproving of the Biden-Harris administration's approach to foreign policy, we all agreed. We don't necessarily see eye to eye on every issue up and down the line. I mean, there are issues that we have that other groups don't share, and vice versa. But on the question of should we send a message to President Biden and Vice President Harris, we were in full agreement. I can tell you that we have many dear friends and longstanding allies in the Arab and Muslim worlds. They fall into several camps, right? You have the pro-Trump people, although the vote was, I think, leaned Biden last election. Within the Biden camp, or let's say the Democratic leaning side of those communities, there are in turn 2 different groups. One is kind of like they're loyal party Dems, and they are outraged at the policy, but they feel like they should throw a fit, make a protest, raise holy hell, and then come home to the Democratic Party because they see Trump as worse. And then there are others, including many of our good friends, who don't feel that way at all and feel like President Biden was actively complicit, armed the genocide against the people, the Palestinians. And that falls in the category of unforgivable sins. And they're focused on making the politicians responsible for that genocide pay a price. I think that aligns more with our view because we have nowhere to go home to. It's not like, we're going to be like, well, we're angry at Trump or Harris or Biden, and we'll throw a fit, but then loyally lined up behind them. It's like, I see no cause for that. I mean, there might be Armenians who are loyal, whose first loyalties run to Trump or first loyalties run to Harris, who might counsel us to, well, of course, in the end, you must do the right thing and our preferred candidate. But
pick the lesser of two evils, whoever you perceive that evil to be.
We don't endorse evil as a rule, even if they are lesser evils. We do not endorse evils, and we will not lend our support to those who have led to the killings of so many young Armenians, old Armenians, men and women, children, and they're going to have to earn our support.
Aram, if you do not show some kind of retribution to the administration, and that would be through elections, then what recourse do we have? You have to tell them that if you fail us, it's okay. You're going to sit outside the White House until you come back and you say, we don't want to go back out because we failed these guys. We failed this community, right? So otherwise, they're going to say, you can talk all you want and everything will be fine because at the end, you're going to vote for us.
Yeah. For those uninitiated into the U.S. politics, and I'm sorry, hold your thought, Aram, but also tell us what this means mechanically at the elections. Does it mean that people just sit home, or did they go and vote in a certain way?
You know what? Our hope and our expectation is that these politicians, let me say it this way, it's their call. Ball's in their court. If they would like to earn Armenian votes, they can earn Armenian votes. That's up to them. This notion that we're going to fall on our sword for folks is not going to happen. The idea that we will fall for a set of promises, that's simply not going to happen. The things that need to be delivered can be delivered this week, right? So, for example, former President Trump could call the leaders of the House, who are Republican, and say, we want HRES 7288, which is the Lawler bill to cut military aid to Azerbaijan. Let's get that to the floor and get it passed. That's one phone call. Senator Vance is a sitting senator. He could co-sponsor SRES 540, which would trigger investigations into Azerbaijan's misuse of U.S. military assistance. Vice President Harris could announce on behalf of the administration that as a matter of law, as a matter of policy, they are suspending all military aid to Azerbaijan. They've done so kind of like tacitly, but with no assurance whatsoever that tomorrow they won't change their minds. So it's within her power before the election to deliver for our community. And I think we would take that into account going into the ballot box. And the same is true of the Republican side. That's the test. That's the test. Now, once again, I would say that within our community, we have probably a pretty standard bell curve of left to right, and it might correspond with where we are in the country. So an Armenian who lives in Tulsa, Oklahoma, probably will vote like other people who live in Tulsa, Oklahoma. The same can be said of Los Angeles or Boston or Atlanta. But I think we fall across a pretty normal array of voting patterns within our community. I think we stand out as a group that will cross party lines to support those who support us. And I think that's a really healthy part of our community that doesn't exist in every community. I think I know a lot of Armenian Democrats who supported Bob Dole. I know a lot of Armenian Republicans who support Frank Pallone. This is a very common thing in our world that Democrats, Republicans are all good and well, but this is Hayastan and this is the Haidanic. We have to protect it. There are within our world, and I don't say this as criticism, but there are those within our world who would weaponize the Armenian issue to advance their Democratic or Republican political agenda. And that's where we kind of draw a line and say, fight your battles with your resources, not with our votes. So if a prominent Armenian gives Trump or Harris a free pass for their sins, what they're signaling is how very low their standards are and how very low their expectations are. And if the signal goes out to politicians that we ourselves don't take our issues seriously, fine. arm Azerbaijan to kill Armenians, and we'll still support you. If we disrespect ourselves at that level and then expect others to respect us, that's, delusional, right? We have to respect ourselves, respect our votes, and then others will respect us. And that begins by not giving a free pass to people who've committed horrendous sins against us. That being said, Asbed and Hovik, they're just those who are so loyally, so tribal in their loyalties that they would sell our issue to their politicians, their favorite politicians, in return for God knows what, because all these people do is lie. If there's one way to characterize U.S. diplomacy on issues that matter to Americans of Armenian heritage, to Armenian Americans, it's that just constant lying.
Mm-hmm.
Constant lying about the status of Artsakh going back centuries and centuries. I remember some years ago, the CIA declassified documents from the Cold War era, which very plainly spoke about Artsakh as Armenian land, historic Armenian land. But of course, they lied about that in their public discourse for years. They lied about Azerbaijan's aggression. They lied about the parity that they saw in violence from the two sides. They lied during the blockade. They lied after the blockade. They're lying today. They did so on the genocide issue, on every issue that we care about. They're constantly lying to us. So the idea that one side or the other will make some set of promises is laughable at this point.
So, Aram, how come I haven't heard anything about an Armenian equivalent of a national uncommitted movement or a call to join forces with the Arab American movement or whatever strategy to amplify these concerns and get heard? I mean, what's the strategy? Does the ANC plan to recommend one candidate or another or no candidate at all? What's the plan?
I think the uncommitted was a dynamic primarily within the primary process. It's an option that is afforded to primary voters. I think some Republican states, but I think a lot of Democratic states. So that was the preferred vehicle. Our friends in the Arab community opted against the write-in idea, right? Where people would write in, let's say,
Yes, uncommitted.
Well, ultimately there is an uncommitted line, so they could just check the uncommitted box or push the uncommitted button. But that option is sadly not available to us going into the federal election because you can only vote for one of the candidates who are on the ballot.
But you can also leave it blank, right?
Yeah.
And the thing is that if, let's say, a few 100,000 Arabs and Armenians were to just leave the presidential boxes empty while they vote for their local and state candidates, that could make a big difference because they're saying that it's going to be a fairly close race between Harris and Trump.
Yeah, I agree. I agree with that. And so to answer, I think, the core of the question, which is what are we going to recommend? I would say we will use these remaining days to secure actual deliverables from the candidates. As I said, Vance and Trump have things that they can deliver today. Harris and the President Biden, can deliver things today. So that option remains available to them. And absent that, I don't know how we endorse an evil, right? I don't see us endorsing an evil, the lesser of evils, the better of evils, whichever. That's simply not in the cards. But we'll have to take a careful look at how we make our voice heard, because at the end of the day, and this is not going to be popular among our strong partisans, again, who are some of our favorite Armenians, right? Partisan Dems and partisan Republicans are some of our dearest and most valuable friends. They may not be happy to hear that their victory or defeat is not our concern. Our concern is how, coming out of this election, policymakers and political leaders will view Armenians as a group that was crossed and created costs for that offense. Mm-hmm. That's the outcome that matters for us. And I think we've established that pretty well. We have about 7 or 8 weeks to drive that point home, that the Armenians are not simply a group that has the logos. We're not simply a group that has the pathos. We are a group that has the ethos, the electoral constituency to make a difference. If we can't do it on our own, we'll do it in coalition with others. If we can't do it in California and New York and Massachusetts, we'll do it in Michigan, Wisconsin, and Pennsylvania. That's, I think, going to be our approach. It's not the easy answer, I think, that folks would like, which is, on balance, Trump or Harris will be better or worse. First of all, I don't think anyone who makes predictions about who will be better or worse really knows what they're talking about. I don't think anyone, I just don't think they know what they're talking about. They may have some, speculations or guesses, maybe best estimates and all. But the idea that we would put our name behind a candidate who armed the genocide of Artsakh based on some speculation about what they might do. It's like really thin soup. That's simply not the basis for us to lend our name to their campaigns.
Okay, with 61 or 62 days to go, I hope, Aram, we can catch up one more time in the month before the elections and talk about where we are.
Absolutely.
Thank you for joining us today.
Thank you, Aram.
We appreciate your time.
Asbed, Hovik, appreciate all that you do. You are great teachers to the nation, great communicators. It is an honor to be on your show.
Likewise.
Thank you so much. Talk to you soon.
Okay, bye-bye.
That's our show today. This episode was recorded on September 4, 2024. We've been talking with Mr. Aram Suren Hamparian, who is the Executive Director of the Armenian National Committee of America in Washington, D.C. I'm Asbed Bedrossian.
And this is Hovik Manucharyan.
Please follow us on social media and follow us everywhere you get your Armenian news. The links are in the show notes. Thanks for listening. We'll talk to you soon.